Ladies, gentlemen, and Harajam of all ages, we are at a very important point in the life cycle of Season 2, most notably because this is when Season 2 starts to become less of a thing that people focus on, with a lot of people who aren't overly attached to pushing further tiers of Abattoir of Zir now about to just stop playing and take their break until Season 3. I thought it would be a perfect time to talk about Season 3, specifically what we know about it, and how the things that we know relate to the things that have happened in the past week or so for Season 2, especially now that we have had around a week since the release of Abattoir, and seen how the devs responded to the criticism of that event as well. So today we're going to talk about Season 3 through the lens of Season 2. We're going to talk about what we know about it and why our current experience in this late stage of Season 2 could have an extremely notable impact on the next season as well. First then, let's talk about what we know about the Season 3 that is, because it's actually very little. The season will be starting in the last week of January, right around the end of when Season 2 happens, and so far we don't even have a proper name for the season, with the devs themselves referring to it as the Season of the Orange Text, which is sort of funny. However, it's worth noting that any longtime Diablo player worth their salt recognizes this so-called orange text looks a hell of a lot like the symbols they've used for runes in previous Diablo games, and so we can assume that this could in fact be our quote-unquote seasonal power-up, the equivalent of Malignant Hearts in Season 1, Vampiric Powers in Season 2, and unfortunately we just know nothing about how these would function as a power in Diablo 4, but my best personal guess is that they might be close to how runes worked in Diablo 3, offering some notable changes to the way certain skills work for each class, almost like enhancements that we have now in the skill tree, but if we had another option, a further option, which would be quite neat if so. As far as relating this to the current season, this isn't really the part that concerns me, because if we track the difference from Season 1's Malignant Heart powers, which weren't great across the board, to Season 2's Vampiric powers, which generally people were a fan of just as a whole, sure, there is still imbalance in these, but at least the ones that are imbalanced are also fun. Like having ridiculous attack speed from Ravenous is an enjoyable state to be in as a player, even if it is a bit overpowered for the classes it works for, whereas the Barber in Season 1 was just, hey, look, enemies blow up sometimes, that's really effective, but it doesn't make it feel better. That said, another thing to pay attention to is that the developers have made a point of not nerfing a single thing this entire season. Nothing build or class related, nothing power related. They stuck to their guns, and that has allowed us as players to have a consistently enjoyable season compared to what would have happened if they gutted some of our builds. The developers have specifically said to expect balance changes in between the seasons, though. There are some things currently that are too strong, obviously, but they've decided that the best way to tackle this is to let us enjoy ourselves in the season as a sort of self-contained period of time, only making larger moves to the balance in between, which I quite like. But it does mean that if they get the balance too far off on seasonal power-ups, it could be a big issue if they insist on changing nothing. So we do have to keep an eye on that in general. Then we have the main thing, the main reason that I wanted to make this video, which is the only real announced feature of Season 3 properly that we have so far, and that is the addition to the game of the Gauntlet, which is a challenge dungeon meant to add to our endgame content on a consistent level, and the Hall of Ancients, which is essentially just a leaderboard system for the Gauntlet. From what we have been told about the Gauntlet then, it will essentially be a randomly created dungeon that will be the same for every player, and it also rotates once per week, changing what is in it. The rewards for the system are the leaderboards itself, which split you up by class and then reward you for depending on which bracket you actually fall into, and you get a seal of recognition, and then you get a fancy player frame for your character select menu to represent your glory. The tiers of this seem to be no seal if you don't complete it, then there's 3 different tiers depending on how well you do in general, probably related to certain timers the devs will set themselves, based on trying it themselves as well, and then the big one at the end has a number on it, which implies to me that only the top 1,000 of each class each week will get one of these, and the number that is on the seal itself will likely change to show which specific number you actually got. So if you are the 500th best, it would probably say 500 instead of 1,000, that type of thing, and that is actually a neat way to do that at the very least. All that said, the intention of this is a new endgame mechanic, right? And not just that, but a permanent one to the game. The Gauntlet is not a seasonal specific addition to the game like Abattoir of Zir. This is something that will be added to the game and then kept forever. It will be on the Eternal Realm, so it will be subject to change from how we first see it. But it also means there's a lot more pressure to get it right, and a lot more things to consider about getting it right. Our main comparison for this then is, well, of course, the Abattoir of Zir, which released right around a week ago now. This was also labeled as an ultra endgame activity, and people were excited to try it out, and from day one there were some pretty significant complaints from a large part of the player base. Those complaints being the requirement to even take part in the activity was too high, the sigil powder being pretty insane as a requirement, especially if you were failing runs instead of completing them, and there was also complaint about the lack of actual tangible reward. The best that you really get is a title for reaching tier 20, but most people don't really care about those. It would have been much cooler to have like a unique mount that people know immediately on sight is the Abattoir of Zir mount, a mount that only people who could complete tier 25 could actually get, right? That's the type of thing that people want. They want something they can have permanently as a proper record of their accomplishments, and unlike a title that most people will be unaware of where it actually comes from. They want it to be something they can rub in other people's faces and say, look at this, I did that, without having to explain what it's actually from. Alternatively, even not talking about that type of thing, there should just be better rewards in general, like power-wise. The developers talked not even 2 weeks ago about how they really like that Duriel as a boss is a constant source of 925 item power items, but wish that there were more other ultra endgame things that they could make drop these so people have more options to farm properly high tier gear if they actually want to. And yep, when they released Abattoir, that wasn't the thing that they did here, even though they called it an uber endgame activity, especially with the original scaling of the difficulty being what it was, with tier 1 being harder than a tier 100 nightmare dungeon. I thought this would be the perfect opportunity they would have to be able to give us another source of guaranteed 925 drops, but it just doesn't do that. It could also have been another place to give enhanced Uber Unique drop chances too, maybe like 1% for a tier 1 so it's worse than fighting Duriel, but then have it slowly scale up to the higher tiers to the point that like a tier 20 gives you better chances of an Uber Unique than killing Duriel does, because it is a much harder task to accomplish than killing Duriel. In any case, the thing that concerns me with this though is that the only reward that we have announced for the Gauntlet are the leaderboards, the little seals and the character frames, and I really hope that there is just more there. Seeing yourself on a leaderboard is cool, but getting something special that will matter to you forever for getting a higher tier, like some cool cosmetics, would be a lot better. Then we have my second major concern, which is the difficulty in how they're going to balance it. Abattoir of Zir showed us more than anything just how imbalanced the classes are at the top level, not to mention that Abattoir of Zir is seasonal only, whereas the Gauntlet will also include the Eternal Realm, so it'll have to be balanced for both somehow. Necromancer and Druid players in Abattoir were struggling to do anything above a tier 5 before the hotfix that changed the scaling, whereas on that same scaling, Barbarians were able to reach tier 20 and above. Yes, this is a very large gap, but normally in a game like this, that would be fine. ARPGs are not about the way that you compare to each individual player, and outside of PvP, which is only really cared about by a very small portion of players, the only people you should really actually be comparing yourself to are other people playing the same class as you. And so realistically, in Abattoir of Zir, Necromancers should be competing with other Necromancers, Barbarians with other Barbarians, right? Well, that part will be solved in the Gauntlet because the leaderboard is specifically divided by class to help prevent people from getting overly concerned about the difference between the classes. But that brings us to a very separate but also very notable issue. The reason that Abattoir has such a massive spread of balance between the classes is the specific parameters of the activity. Super high damage intake, but also a timer on the side that you have to beat to actually complete it. So you have to go tanky enough to survive, but not so tanky that your damage is non-existent. As far as we are aware, the Gauntlet will not have tiers like Abattoir does. It does not have a scaling difficulty that you can interact with. It will be one set difficulty for every player in the game for that week. Then the leaderboards will give you a score based on the speed and comfort of completion, theoretically mostly being time-based, but probably also considerations like damage taken and things like that. The issue that I have with this being clearly, at least right now, the top end of each class is extremely different from each other, and so if the Gauntlet only has one set difficulty for all players, what will that look like? Well, if the changes made to the Abattoir of Zir and the hotfix are any indication, I'd say they want it to be a difficulty level that most people in endgame can actually take part in and finish the Gauntlet each week. After all, they made it so tier 1 of Abattoir is now the equivalent difficulty of around a tier 90 nightmare dungeon, when their original intention was tier 100, which is a pretty big drop. And they did that so that more people could actually play the activity. So what I see as being likely is the Gauntlet will likely be relatively difficult, equivalent to a tier 100 dungeon, just a little bit more than that, which means that tankiness will matter, but all the best players with the best builds will be going relatively glass cannon builds comparatively to what is going on now in Abattoir, because they will not scale a 1 difficulty activity to make it hard enough to survive, as challenging as it is currently in higher tiers of Abattoir, which means getting through as quickly as possible will be the main goal of most players. This means that something that could be challenging just to get to the end of on one class could instead be treated as a blindfolded foot race by another one, just tripping over themselves, trying to get as much speed as possible without the fear of death, and that would be really off for it, honestly. And the thing is, that could be even further worse than this, because again, the Gauntlet is a permanent activity. It's also being added to the Eternal Realm, and what that means is that the Gauntlet has to be both completable by people on the Eternal Realm and people in the Seasonal Realm. Seasonal powers are a just sort of default power increase, which means that us on the Seasonal Realm will be stronger than people on the Eternal Realm. So if they want people on the Eternal Realm to still be able to complete the Gauntlet, that means they have to make it easier than they would otherwise do for just people on the Seasonal Realm. The exception to this is if they make it a different one each week for Seasonal and Eternal. That way we actually have our own scaling that more fits in with our own balancing, and I think that would be a good idea, but I just don't know if we can expect them to put in that bit of extra effort there. And this is where I think they need to take more inspiration from the greater rifts of Diablo 3. Those had levels to them that you could choose as a player, and there was also a leaderboard attached to them. That way you could compare yourselves to others of the same class, but also due to the difficulty scaling of the greater rifts, you could find a spot that felt right for your class, right for your build, right for you to still have fun and see how you rank. But if this gauntlet just has one set difficulty, it will be a lot harder to actually reach that balance, to find that spot. And it's worth noting on the example leaderboard screen that they gave us, it was actually full of level 95 characters. Sure, that is likely just a production image and not indicative of final balancing, but to put my point into perspective, if someone who isn't even level 100 is able to finish this in their pre-testing, that means the super tryhard 1% won't care about this at all. And as much as that tryhard audience is not the majority of the player base by any means, it is the people who dedicate the most time to the game. And so the developers, of course, want to make these people happy at least as much as they want to make the casual audience happy too. That said, there's an entire secondary consideration here too, which is the randomness. From what we know, the Gauntlet will be one set dungeon that rotates every week, and there are two ways for them to treat it. The low effort way would be to make it like Abattoir of Zir. Once per week it just picks a dungeon theme, a couple of monster families, and it creates a layout based on that purely at random with procedural generation, and then that is our dungeon for the week, rotating every week. This would be easier for them to do for sure, but would also just result in a lot of varying quality of the experience each week. For example, how Bloodseekers getting vampiric or suppressor affixes absolutely ruined Abattoir of Zir runs, but with the caveat that if you knew for one whole week, every time you do the Gauntlet it would be full of suppressors, you would probably purposely build around that and find a build for your class that could deal with it. That said, the game doesn't really, feel good to play multiple builds in right now. It costs a lot of gold to actually move stuff around. You don't really have the space to have multiple builds sitting around, so they would need to improve that too if that's how they want to treat the Gauntlet. So randomness does actually play better when it is set for a period of time afterwards, because you can deal with it. You can go into it knowing it will happen. But the game isn't really built in a way where that feels good right now. They have to change that. That said, in my mind, the absolute ideal way for them to do this is to just get some of the dev team to sit down and design a dungeon layout once per week with the idea of doing something fun and different. Not just making a dungeon like the ones that we already have, but it's different once every week, but making it actually notably special. Maybe one week the dungeon is literally all elites. It only has elites. They have all the affixes in the game. They can choose from anything. Elites are everywhere and it's nuts, but it encourages very different play. Maybe one week it is literally no elites. It is all trash, but every pack also has one of those defense boosting champions that you have to focus down first. I think that'd be a really fun way for them to do it. Rather than just using your procedural generation in a standard way, use it to make interesting and unusual parameters each week that change the way that you have to tackle the activity. Maybe one week they would have to scale it down in difficulty in general, but then every single room there's a butcher. Every room there's a butcher. So you can make multiple butchers attack you at the same time, and then the absolute top of the leaderboards would be people that are fighting like 10 butchers at once, murdering them in a giant pile. And that is a really cool idea to me. Rather than just using your procedural generation in a standard way, use it to make interesting and unusual parameters each week that change the way that you have to tackle the activity. That said, I don't expect that to actually be what we get. I only hope it is what happens, because again, what we are having to base our expectations on as of right now is the Abattoir of Zir as the closest comparable activity we have seen in the game so far. And right now, my worry is unless they use all the feedback that we've given them from Abattoir of Zir, and unless they get the balance between each class a fair bit better for next season than it is right now, we are absolutely going to run into a situation where the Gauntlet every single week is either so hard that the more casual players can't even take part in it, or so easy that the really top end of players are bored with it and don't enjoy it either. Having a singular tiered activity makes it really hard to find that exact balance, and I think that the Abattoir of Zir shows that. Given the scaling that we now have after the hotfix is absolutely wild from tier 1 to tier 25. Essentially, overall, I am tentatively excited to learn more about the Gauntlet as an activity. All we can really do right now is speculate about it and compare notes to what they've done with the Abattoir of Zir, and all I can really say at the end of the day is that Abattoir had a lot of issues. It had a lot of good, for sure, but also a lot of bad. And I think it still does have a decent amount, but the devs were extremely quick and quite potent with fixing a lot of the larger issues that we had with it as a community. But the way that they fix the issues doesn't really apply to how the Gauntlet is going to work from our knowledge. In other words, I am very wary of how the Gauntlet is going to function at release, but at the same time, I'm getting relatively confident that the devs will work quickly to fix any of the easier to combat issues that we as a player base have with the activity, just as they did with the Abattoir of Zir. Sure, they didn't address all of our concerns, but they addressed honestly the most major of them, and they did it in a respectable way that considers both the high-end casual audience and the super high-end challenge lords at the same time, which is an impressive thing to pull off, especially in a hotfix, which means there wasn't even much time for them to plan and work it out before just going for it. That's it. It all depends on how competent the activity is on its own merits to begin with. If it has a strong foundation with just some numerical issues, that's easy to fix, just like they have been doing with the Abattoir. If it has more structural issues with the activity at its base, like how the difficulty will be the same for every player, then I think we have a bit more to worry about here. But mostly, I just want to have more information on this. I want to see what it is, because somehow the Abattoir has both made me more excited for the Gauntlet and for Season 3, and also made me more concerned about how its initial execution will actually go. What do you all think then? Do you agree with me? What are your thoughts and expectations for Season 3, especially now with the context of the Abattoir of Zir under our belts? Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world our stage. Goodbye.